Council work session of Thursday, October 22nd, 2020 is called to order at 6:04 p.m. Present are Mayor Byrne, Law Director Picorni, Director Patton, Councilwoman Everett, Councilwoman Danzig, Councilwoman Walsh, Councilman Haas, Councilman Rounds, and myself. This time I'd like to turn the meeting over to the mayor.
Good evening, Council. It is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Chris Hopkins from CT Consultants. Chris has been working with the city in reviewing our zoning ordinances for the reason to update them. We feel that this was the next step after we had adopted the master plan, that this was a natural progression to review. We probably had spent almost 50 years and some of the ordinances have been reviewed and really updated. So Chris has become very familiar with City Hall here. She's met internally with the administration. Last week she gave a presentation to the Planning Commission, which Councilman Stavoli, you'll have the opportunity to hear it again for the second time. But tonight she's going to give a presentation to Council with what's been worked on. This all coincides with the moratorium that we have on in effect right now. This is a step in the process to get the zoning reviewed, adopted, and move on. So with that, I turn the meeting over to you, Chris.
Okay. Good evening. If any of you were able to watch last week or view the presentation, I assure you it won't be as long. So I'm going to cut to the chase, and we're going to go right to the goals of the project. And so, as Mayor Byrne said, this is the natural progression of actually two planning studies that have been done in the last few years for Parma Heights. The first one is the Parma Heights Master Plan, and that did provide some policy recommendations for the commercial corridor along Curl and along West 130th. And some of those key things were related to encouraging infill development, creating a sense of place, a memorable place that people want to come back to, a mix of uses. And the recommendations were related to adopting a mixed-use zoning district. And then over the course of the last few months, we did do a deeper dive into the corridor to actually analyze it, to figure out what's the best sort of districts to propose. And that's on the next slide. I'll go over that. But the other study that was completed in the last few years was the Parma Heights Complete and Green Streets Plan. That was a Transportation for Livable Communities plan. And in that document, it also talked about a town center area, being right in this vicinity here, and then highlighted the character of Pearl Road and how the regional RTA views this Pearl Road as what they are calling a priority transit corridor. So it's a direct link downtown. And so based on the master plan and the Complete and Green Street plan, the idea really is to then spur revitalization in a way that helps achieve the goals of the comprehensive plan and the TLCI. And that's related to encouraging infill development and redevelopment. And so this next slide highlights the areas that, what you could call character areas, in terms of the areas along the corridor and how they differentiate among themselves. And some of the things that we looked at in terms of doing the detailed parcel analysis and the things that became obvious under this list of considerations that you don't have. This is a condensed slide or a consolidated slide from the conversation. You have the plan itself, you don't have the talking points. So, in terms of what we are looking at and what plays a role in the types of zoning districts that we would create are things like the Greenbrier Commons, and the fact that that's a concentration right now that you have of recreation, entertainment, theater, that sort of thing, and the library, so cultural activities. So that's really an anchor, a big anchor for the city. And then when you look along the whole, this corridor, Pearl Road and West 130th, there is quite a range of uses. It's primarily zoned, the C district, but that district right now is not well defined, and so there's a large range of use types found in the corridor. And then also when you look along the corridor, it's interspersed with two larger religious uses which break up the corridor. So it's not just one stream of retail on both sides of the street. It is broken up somewhat. Another key consideration in how we formulate or fashion mixed-use districts is the fact that the future of retail is uncertain. It was prior to COVID-19. A lot of people, every year, more and more people were buying things online. Now almost everyone is pretty comfortable buying online. And so there's really an uncertainty in terms of what will that do in terms of the buildings that are existing that are occupied by retail uses, and what types of retail uses will survive, that sort of thing. Also, another consideration along the corridor are the variety of lot sizes and lot depths and lot widths. And so you have some very small lots. Actually, when we did the analysis, the average lot size is around an acre, 1.25 acres, something like that. 70-some percent are under that. So that doesn't lend itself to a wide variety of uses. So that's a consideration. And the smaller lot depth means that you have residential uses very close to retail uses. There's also fragmented ownership, which is not so much a zoning issue, but it is a quote, redevelopment issue. Another physical characteristic, especially on the south side along Pearl Road, is the small distance, the short distance between the residential blocks. So the depth of two lots back to back, and so you may have 3 or 4 or 5 different retail parcels between those two residential streets. And so that's a very small concentration of retail or non-residential along in between those residential streets. And then because of, okay. And then because of the small lots and the variety of uses and fragmented ownership, you have a number of curb cuts all along the corridor, which, as cars come and go, that's more points or more places where people could conceivably, pedestrians could have interaction with the car, so you could, so that reduces the walkability and the desire to walk. So it's not only more difficult, but people tend not to walk around if it's not a pleasant and conducive environment. So those are the considerations. And then thinking about the goals as outlined in the two different plans, and how you go about attracting new development and redevelopment, one of the key things is updating the zoning regulations, because updating the zoning regulations so that they are clearer and are they allow property owners and developers to have a clearer idea of what the city wants and what the city will approve. And so having a good set of updated regulations is key, because it will actually attract developers who will come and say, okay, they've already got all their ducks in a row, so I can propose something that they've already said they want to see, and it should go smoothly. Then some of the other goals, creating compact centers, so again, trying to create more of a walkable environment. So some of the two areas that seemed to make sense for that were the town center area, and then as you look along West 130th. And those are prime locations for that, especially the West 130th area, as a way of promoting and attracting new development based on the location within the region. And so you've got, it's right adjacent to Southland Shopping Center. And so you've got the opportunity then to provide zoning that is compatible with what's across the street, to be coordinated with and connected to Southland, and coordinate with Middleburg Heights. And as I mentioned before, the proximity of Greenbrier Commons and then also the Big Creek Parkway, those are two assets that make the location desirable from a living and a working standpoint. So maximizing the connections to those amenities. Also in both plans, there were recommendations for improving the appearance and the quality, the walking and pedestrian and biking environment along the street. So those go beyond zoning. And then to the extent that the city is able to provide incentives will also, may also be needed in order to attract new development. So that gives you some underlying explanation for where we're going now and looking at the three mixed-use districts that are what's outlined in the proposed text. And so based on the different characteristics and concentration of uses in the corridor, I have proposed, and what's drafted in Chapter 11XX, are three different districts, zoning districts. All three of them are allow a range of uses, so they're considered mixed-use districts. Mixed use typically means there is a residential allowance for some type of residential. So it's a mix of commercial and some types of residential. The town center area, town centers are defined as areas where you compact, walkable, bikeable environments, higher density, so that you have the ability to attract people who are attracted to live there, then are there, and they can walk to the grocery store if there's a store, or other convenience stores, restaurants, entertainment. So in a traditional town center area, you have a wide range of uses, and typical to that are the connection to entertainment and recreation, as with the Greenbrier Commons. Recommended from a density standpoint is a minimum of 2 stories and up to 5 stories. The 2 stories helps to provide a more defined space, so that in public open space typically is something that's provided in a town center. And so the taller the building is, the better it provides a framework, or helps frame the environment. So when you think about, when you look across the street and how big the parking lot is, and the buildings aren't very tall, it's a big expanse of space, of pavement, and so it's not a very inviting space. And so when you think about somebody who's walking along the sidewalk and then they have to walk through the parking lot to get to the store through that big parking lot, that is not as desirable of a space as what typical town center developments have. And then, as I mentioned before, making taking advantage of connectivity to Greenbrier and Big Creek. Then the second district that's outlined is the West 130th Gateway. And I would say that these labels right now are more descriptive labels, and they can be tweaked. But in order to distinguish among the three different areas. So as I mentioned before, West 130th is right adjacent to Southland and Middleburg Heights. So it's the gateway, it's the west gateway into Parma Heights. This, in terms of the master plan identified West 130th as an environment for light industrial, but if you read the text more closely, what the master plan emphasizes is this area as an employment center. So it's not just any old industrial or light industrial. It's really targeting businesses that have higher levels of employment. So they're providing jobs, and they're providing jobs with a good pay, good wages. So offices as well. And then in looking at what's across the street and seeing some of the concepts that Middleburg Heights is contemplating, retail and residential also make sense and are compatible with the shopping center across the street. In this location, it is appropriate for one-story buildings, but also up to five-story buildings, and there are a couple of office buildings that are 3 to 5 stories tall, so you've already got that presence along West 130th. And then in between those two centers, core areas where there's larger and more dense development, we have what's labeled here neighborhood scale type district. And right now there is a mix of residential and retail and automotive uses. And so we had some discussion at the Planning Commission meeting as to, what is the right range of uses, and we can fine tune that, but in general, because of the smaller lots, the shallower lots, and because it's interspersed and close to residential, backing up to residential, and interspersed with the religious uses, the range of uses is much more limited. And in this case, the recommendation is that the buildings, the allowable height be reduced to 2 stories or so. And that is partly because the goal is to encourage denser development in these 2 core areas. And one way to do it is to restrict where it can occur elsewhere. So that's the rationale for both the reduced range of uses and number of stories. And then thinking about the mixed-use developments and attracting infill and redevelopment along the corridor, and the purpose of doing it as not only for increasing the tax base, but creating an environment that attracts newcomers to Parma Heights. There are a variety of design principles that are embraced for this mixed-use walkable environment. And as I mentioned, one of them is including housing, adding the allowance for housing. Now, zoning, when you have a variety of uses that are allowed, zoning isn't going to dictate where the houses go versus where the retail goes unless you zone those areas differently. So what we're saying, though, is that it's appropriate, and this is up for discussion, but it's appropriate anywhere these 3 districts would be applied, that there is an assumption that there is some type of residential. If it were proposed by a developer, some type of residential would be appropriate. And what's noted here is from a town center area, the more you have residents either within the district or very close to the district, the more you have people who are there to support, who can support the businesses. The second one is orienting buildings to the street, and that helps create a walkable environment that encourages people to park and then walk from one business to the next. It also having connections, orienting buildings to the street and having connections to the street. The third bullet is talks about creating inviting corners for pedestrians. And so when you think about the corner of Stump and York with Pearl Road, that would be a prime area for doing something special at the corner, creating it, some key landmark type thing. We talk about outdoor rooms, that sort of thing. Again, those types of amenities help make the district more walkable, more pedestrian friendly. The next two bullets talk about uses, and the first one being the mix of uses, and so offices and housing, and as it's noted here, they help support, they are compatible with and help support use of transit, which is one of the things that the Complete Streets is advocating. The second one on getting the retail right, and talking about where, again, being pedestrian friendly, pedestrian oriented, so that the environment isn't so dominated by cars and it's more inviting to pedestrians. The third one, adding community spaces and special features. And so this is a common thing with newer development, and especially, we had a lot of restaurants that didn't have outdoor dining prior to the summer, but then it became a critical feature to be able to allow people places to sit and eat outside of your restaurant. So providing community spaces, open spaces, is an important feature, both from an aesthetic standpoint, a community gathering type thing, and then we're seeing it from a restaurant's needs as well. And then the last bullet is where the parking goes, and so recommending and encouraging or requiring parking to be either adjacent to the side of the building or behind the building, so that, and this allows you to bring buildings closer to the street, and that's another technique, standard to encourage people to walk along the street. And it also then is able to, when you start doing that, there's the ability to share driveways and reduce curb cuts. So the next few examples, next few slides were in the handout that you had, and it gives some illustrations of how existing commercial areas can be redeveloped, retrofitted, to become more of the kind of development that's advocated and promoted in the comprehensive plan. So this one is showing how two buildings side by side could be made to look more like a unit, and add some outdoor seating and encourage, get better distinction of where the parking is and using more landscaping to screen it. On the next slide, this is looking at 3 independent parcels with buildings that have some parking in front, and techniques that you can use to bring the buildings, the appearance of the buildings closer to the street through building additions, and then reducing the curb cuts and having cross-access easements along the back of the buildings, so that it's easier to get in and out and move around with just 2 access points or 3 access points instead of what above is showing 5. On the next slide, this one is giving another example of redevelopment and again, how landscaping can be increased to provide a more pleasant environment and curb cuts be reduced. On this next example, this is appropriate for your larger shopping centers, including across the street. And this is one way infill development can help increase the density of development within the existing shopping center. And so in this example, it's showing how you can reduce the amount of pavement devoted to parking by adding smaller buildings in the parking area itself, creating more of like a Main Street type environment where you've got buildings on both sides. The parking then is separated and behind, and so in between each of those buildings is how you would access the parking lots. And then to the extent residential makes sense, having residential adding new buildings to increase the number of dwelling units, add housing units. This is another example of that same shopping center and how it could be redeveloped and maintaining the centralized parking lot, but reducing the appearance of the parking lot by adding these liner buildings across or along the street at the sidewalk. And then the next two slides are related to what's called this missing middle housing, and the increase in attractiveness for this what's labeled missing middle goes back to the 2008 housing crisis, and we still have a number of a larger percentage of the population that choose to rent. They choose to rent. They may be able to buy a house, but choose to rent for a variety of reasons. And they also, there has been a trend for smaller units. There's also a desire for new types of dwelling units. And so when you think about the corridor along Pearl Road, primarily in between the two streets, say two residential streets, the ability to construct, the allowance to construct this type of fourplex building perhaps, something along those lines, not large apartment buildings like what you have across the street, but something smaller that over time could start to create more of a residential environment like you have towards the eastern end of the city, with more trees, less pavement for parking, and transition from the existing commercial to residential. So that's the overview of the concepts. In terms of how do you actually enact new zoning regulations, so some of these things came up at the last week's meeting. So what's included in this chapter for these 3 mixed-use districts address the uses, the development standards, design requirements, guidelines. What's necessary are anything that's listed as a conditional use in the code, the draft code. Typically there's specific standards, development standards for individual conditional uses. For example, gas stations, dealing with where the canopies can go, things like that. Within this draft code, there's mention of a development plan review process. So the city right now has a plan review process for the development district, which is how the Big Lots project property was developed using the development district itself. And to the extent that conditional uses are included in this text, then the city would need to adopt conditional use review And actually, the city, currently, Chapter 1135, special permits, that could be, that's similar to commercial, conditional uses, because it's allowing, right now, allowing churches and schools and like city facilities in districts with the authority or authorized by council. Typically, conditional uses are types of uses that are reviewed and granted, approved by planning commission. There are some communities that do planning commission review and then a review by planning commission with a recommendation to council, and council approves. So those are two different models. And then non-conforming uses. So to the extent that any of these districts that are proposed do not include uses that are in wherever that district would be applied. And one of the comments was about the gas stations and how do we address gas stations? And if they are there now and they're not permitted in the new code, they would become grandfathered, so they would be non-conforming uses, which according to state law, they are allowed to remain. But it's up to the city as to how you regulate their continued use. And one of the recommendations in, I think it was in the TLCI, the Complete and Green Streets, right now your non-conforming use, if it's abandoned, is a 2-year time frame. State law allows you to reduce to be between 6 months and 2 years. And in environments where the goal is to encourage redevelopment, the shorter the time frame, the better, the more effective those regulations are. And also then looking at the uses and some of the terminology in the proposed or the draft text, there are definitions that need to be developed so that the various uses are defined precisely, so the city can, in its review, say when a proposal is a certain type of use and when it's not. And it's not always, it's not always clear cut. And then the last thing is the zoning map would need to be amended. And so based on the discussion over the next couple of weeks, what you have been presented with are concepts of where these 3 different districts could be applied. In order to amend and apply those districts to specific properties, we need to take the zoning map and actually apply a brand-new color related to that district to specific parcels. So it's got to be very precise, parcel by parcel, where it would be applied. So, so with that, we can move on to review the text and go through it page by page, or if you already are quite familiar with it and you want to just go take questions, or if you have any questions on the presentation.
I do. So how do you get this to come together? Let's use across the street for an example, and that's going to be the town center. Consider town center. We don't own any property over there. We own everything over this way. And one person owns the strip there and most of the parking lots. Mm-hmm. And I'm not quite sure, but I believe that the 2 banks own their own property. I'm not sure, but, and Flyers is a separate parcel. So is the drugstore and the apartment building and the empty lot. Right. Mm-hmm. How do you start this? Like the big place over there, if for 2 years somebody doesn't go into one of the 2,400 square feet there, they can still have somebody go in there at 3 years, or then are they going to lose that?
Oh, so, actually,
I don't know if I'm explaining myself
Yeah.
correctly. How do you get multiple parcels to get on the same page to get a concept? If one person owned everything there, it'd be an easier sell.
absolutely, absolutely.
But when we're pieced in parts, kind of like on Pearl Road where all the little shops are, you know, 3 of them might be owned by one person, one's by another, 4 by another. And I don't know if that's a question that you can answer, but where do you start to start the process?
So it's a very good question, because zoning isn't going to make that happen. Zoning is going to facilitate that. It's going to make it easier. So communities that have the need to redevelop for whatever reason, typically it starts with a plan, and then you have your zoning regulations updated, and then you simultaneously identify steps that the city can take to promote the concepts, to work with property owners that are bigger property owners, to work with them and see what their level of interest is. The only way you can make it happen is if you have properties that are blighted properties. If they're not to that level, then the best way to encourage private property owners to go this route is to try to incentivize the development. And communities that have done that have, they've done it through a variety of mechanisms. One is that if you, and again, you know, a lot of it depends on money, but if there are buildings that come up with it, if there's a targeted area that works best to, that the city wants to focus redevelopment and encourage the redevelopment, that as properties come up for sale, and the city is aware of that, then the city, to the extent has the capacity to do so, could purchase the property. And so then over time, the city works towards land assembly, so that you do have a larger area that then, if you're able to acquire that, so for example, if you're able to acquire everything from big lots to the street, and granted Walgreens is in good shape, so you probably, Walgreens wouldn't be, but if you were to acquire those areas and have ownership, then you could go out for proposals, look for developers who would be interested in doing a redevelopment project. It's not easy. There's, you know, don't mean to imply that it is. But in order to get started and to take the approach of selling these ideas with existing property owners, is to have the regulations in place. Because those, you know, it takes a while, takes months to get everybody to agree on what the regulations should be, and then go through the amendment process, which is public hearings and review by planning commission, review by council.
Thank you. I just have one more question.
Sure.
So I'm going to use that as an example also. So if, I don't know, let's just say ice cream stores aren't allowed in this district, and there's an ice cream store there, and it's only in one spot, then an ice cream store can't go in there in the future?
Well, unfortunately, that's the ice cream stores are wanted everywhere.
Well, yeah, I just, I did have these masks make everything so difficult to think even. Let me go down and know what's,
So I think there's one parcel down the street where, from my vantage point, it looks like it's an outdoor industrial type use. I can't think of it offhand, but it's down, it's down past the church. But it's behind 2 or 3 buildings along the street. I'm not sure. Does anyone?
ABC rental, is that what,
The Italian club or whatever that's back there?
or are you further down, Chris?
Gosh, I'm sorry.
yes, the ABC's,
Let me see if I can,
Bosco and,
And that would be the big complex behind,
yeah, there is a big,
Italian club or whatever.
no, on the other side.
ABC has it
Other
behind
side.
them.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Or are you looking at Liberty, or the old Integrity Chevy?
no, I think it's ABC rental. I
Okay.
think you're right. I think that's what it
Okay.
is. Because there's a building behind, and when you look at some of the, aerial photos that are available, it looks like there's parking outside, or they might have storage of
Right,
things
right.
outside.
I think there's apartments there too, I think
Yeah,
there's 2
there are
apartments.
condominiums just to the west.
No, right by ABC, isn't there the next driveway over? There's 2 above the,
Fitz, is it Litz?
Litz and the Flower-rama it was at one time or something. I think there's still a flower store in there. They have apartments above them. But actually, that would be a very good
Oh, right-
example,
right in here.
ABC.
Right, so that would become a non-conforming use.
But if they wanted to sell their business, could EFG go in there instead of ABC and do the same work?
Yes.
Okay,
So-
that was my,
Yeah, so if anything were any use that's along the corridor that for some reason the city collectively, planning commission and council decided was no longer a use that you would like to see in the corridor for whatever reason, and use it, okay? In that location, it's no longer permitted. Then that use that's existing keeps its ability to remain as long as that use doesn't change. So the owner, it doesn't matter who owns it. The
so he
ownership
could
can
sell
change.
that piece of property and name it EFG.
Right,
And
right.
still do that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, and when you're dealing with differences between commercial uses, it's not as big of a factor because you have a building that can function. Typically, if it's a commercial building and it's used, like ABC Rental is using it, it could be repurposed for a similar use, commercial use, that would be permitted. So that's, it's an easier way to reuse a building. In contrast to if it were a residential building and you no longer allowed residential, then a residential structure typically isn't compatible with a retail use.
Thank you.
Sir? There's a lot of detail in the code, so if it's whatever you would like, we can go through it, and I can, like I did with the planning commission, an overview of each of the sections.
I did have one question about the definitions. You had,
Yes.
and I don't know if this is for you or if it's for Director Picorni, do we have existing definitions that we are utilizing now? And will those need to be changed?
You have 12 definitions in the zoning code right
Okay.
now.
Okay. So,
They will be expanded.
They will be expanded,
okay.
right, yes.
Thank you.
And so let me bring up the text. So in some places in the text, I identified, well, for the use table, I just generally said, oh, these uses would need to be defined. And so to the extent, I'm looking at eating and drinking establishments, restaurants, bars and taverns, and then microbreweries. And so microbreweries are, and brew pubs are newer types of uses, then they're proliferating. The distinction, and this goes all, I mean, the state of Ohio regulates alcohol beverages, and so they do have different distinctions among these different types of uses. And a microbrewery is a place that actually makes the beer. So like Great Lakes downtown, that sort of. So they're actually doing a production, some sort of production on their commercial site, and then they are selling it usually with food. So that's a conditional use. And so it's very important then in the definitions section to make the distinction between a brew pub, which is a place that sells beer that's made at a brewery, but it's not made on site. Whereas a microbrewery, you're allowing them to make the beer on site. And some of the issues that are related to microbreweries are, regulating where their, whatever, their waste products, so the hops or whatever, where they can store that, typically outside, in the backyard, behind a building, things like that, with some screening. The medical marijuana dispensary, that's already addressed in the code. But then we have another issue that has come up in tattoo parlors versus permanent cosmetics. So there's something, the permanent cosmetics is a use that is done, it's tattoos, but it's done for medical reasons or for other reasons and held to a higher standard perhaps than a body art or tattoo parlor. So that's a common distinction that's becoming more common, I should say. So that's where the definitions become very important. And then vehicle service, minor repair, like tires, changing tires, oil change, versus vehicle repair restoration. Now, they're both conditionally permitted. Right now, they're listed as conditionally permitted uses, but their conditions can be different. So, for example, a vehicle service place that does oil change like a Firestone, they tend to be able to do all their service inside, and it's typically not as noisy. Whereas a vehicle repair, that tends to be defined as major repair, like doing body work and changing engines, things like that, which can be louder, and so you might need a larger separation or distancing from residential, things like that.
And that would be addressed in definitions. Yes.
The definitions would distinguish the two uses, and then in the conditional uses, we would spell out what those conditions are. So there is some work to be done, but it's important to get the list right and decide what's permitted versus what's conditionally permitted. So permitted by right versus conditionally permitted, because once we get those agreed upon, then we decide what's the distinction and what are the right regulations to make. Any other?
Mr. Picorni, did you have any weigh in on?
Are we going to have anything that is not permitted? At this point, our code does not permit used cars unless you own a new car dealership, and it has to be a percentage. So is there going to be anything?
Yeah, that would be included in here. So the way most zoning codes are written is that a use has to be specifically identified as being permitted in a specific zoning district in order for it to be approved. The way the Parma Heights Code is written is very, it's very wide open.
Yeah, it's very general.
Very general. Right, and so.
And you can be anything except A, B, and C.
Right, right. So by doing something that's much more specific in terms of the uses that you'd like to see, that you're going to permit, then there's a section, if it's not in here, it would be added, but there's a section that would say, if it's not on the list, it's not permitted.
Okay.
And then because of the table with the list of uses has 3 different columns, then the N that's in the column now is to indicate that, yes, we intentionally say, no, it's not permitted in this district, rather than, oh, did somebody forget? I mean, why is it, you know, that sort of thing.
So if you, let's use, what are they called? Girly bars, what's a nice way to sexually oriented businesses? If you do not list it, it can't be there, but if you say no, let's use one, licensed treatment facility is the first N. And it's not, as long as it's allowable in one category, is that still like the hard and fast rule? You can't, my understanding of zoning codes was you can't say you can't be here.
That's.
You have to leave a spot that, you know, you.
For sexually oriented businesses, that is true. That there was, it's a matter of free speech.
Right.
So that particular use, there are federal laws that say every community has to carve out some little area where sexually oriented businesses are permitted. The rest of the other
isn't
range
that
of
way?
uses are not protected
Okay.
like that.
So like a tattoo parlor wouldn't fall, like we could say no in every, even though
Could
it's
say
not
that.
the same connotation now than it was 50 years ago. You know, a lot of people, it's very acceptable now. But if we use that, they don't fall under the same guidelines legally as a sexually oriented business.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So the caveat, though, to trying to carve out the uses that you want to permit versus those you don't want to permit is to be fair and reasonable and not arbitrary. So if you have, let's say, some community or codes very often written in the 60s, 70s, 80s, identified retail very specifically, a flower shop, a jewelry store, you know, grocery store, that sort of thing. If you have 2 uses that are very similar in the way they operate in terms of the size of the store, the types of inventory, or the how often deliveries are made, the people that are attracted to it, or you know, if you have 2 uses that are very similar, one's permitted, one's not, it can be hard to turn that similar use away and say, we don't want you, because you have to have a reason as to why, if you've allowed my twin sister, let's say, you've allowed my twin sister to come, but you won't allow me to come, you know, why? Why are you making that distinction?
Okay. Yeah, I'm following. Thank you.
Yep.
How did you kind of come to where it is that what caught my attention is in the neighborhood use category where it says business services including and unlimited shopping, technology, photographic services. I think that already in the neighborhood usage area on Pearl Road, there is a company that does that.
Mhm.
And there's also the vehicle service repair already in the neighborhood area. There's a company that exists and does that. And when you look at the
Yeah.
description about what that might look like, they're meeting that one-story or two-story building.
Yeah. So that question, or something similar to that, came up last week, and so that's where my knowledge of the street and the uses along the street is very limited compared to your knowledge, and your likes and dislikes of those existing uses. So it's very important that planning commission and council review the list and decide and say, okay, well, based on that existing use and the way it operates, you said it shouldn't be permitted, but we're fine with them. Then we would take a look at that and say, okay, what's the benefit of allowing it? Is it a good business, but if a similar business but a different operator went in, what's the chances that somebody could operate it in a way that it's incompatible? So we would think through those different scenarios, and then because we can write the regulations to accommodate the existing use in a limited way. So one of the things with the business services, by calling it business services, tends to be a service that a business would utilize, rather than, which is kind of confusing because, if I'm going to go make copies at Kinko's is more, I would say, is more a service that individuals use, though businesses can use it too. So that one may be something that if you can limit it in the size, in the operation, So oftentimes what makes things compatible with residential and single family that's adjacent to it is limiting the size of the operation, so that you're not getting a lot of truck traffic, or you're not getting a lot of noise, those sorts of things. So yes, this needs to be reviewed by people who know the businesses much better than I do, and then refined, and then we can decide what's the best way to address your existing businesses.
Parking.
Yep.
It's in that also.
And I would say that it would be more appropriate to refine the list of uses than to expand the town center mixed-use district or the West 130 mix. It would be better to try to keep a lower density of development in that neighborhood area, and like I said, just refine the list of uses.
So Chris, would that mean instead of making it an N, make it a C? Okay, thank you.
Right.
I can see too, making A, C kind of can help push some businesses to other areas say maybe this area we might see over here instead of just putting up.
Right. Yes, because typically, and again, this is up for discussion, how each of these, any proposed new use would be approved. But typically, planning commission would look at a development plan or site plan and review it for compliance with the code. But if it's a use permitted by right, it's just a regular meeting with planning commission. If it's a conditional use, then the conditional use application goes through a public hearing process, and adjacent property owners, however that's defined, sometimes it's just anyone who's touching, otherwise, some communities do a 300-foot distance, so any property owner within 300 feet, but they're notified, and they're able to come to the public hearing and weigh in on the proposed use.
So what's the difference between a conditional use and no? Like in the past with our code, it would be, you don't meet the code, so you have to go to BZA, Board of Zoning Appeals, and they can grant you permission to do something you're not allowed to. Does that still work with the N?
That would be what the N would require. Now, one of the things that's occurred since your zoning code was written is, there's a lot of conditions, or there's a lot of review that's been done of Board of Zoning Appeals decisions. And so typically they fall into two different categories, variances. So you have, which means that if something is an N in a particular district, and a property owner petitions, goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals for a variance to allow that use, a proposed use that's not on the list, that's called a use variance. And a use variance, the factors that the Board of Zoning Appeals should be using is that there is no way you can use that property in an economically viable way with any of the uses already permitted. So a use variance, according to the records that have been established, the cases that have, over the last few years, last decades, is that it's very difficult to justify a use variance.
Okay.
There's another variance called an area variance, so that if there's a setback in the regulations and for some reason the building can't be placed.
Especially like with the 75 feet now from a waterway and all that.
Right, so that's allowing a difference in, where the building is placed, could be, landscaping requirements, things like that you can allow. And those have a different set of criteria that the Board of Zoning Appeals should be using.
Okay, so if we put a C on something versus an N, it's a little bit easier than, so an N should be something that we really would not.
Definitely don't want.
Okay.
If there's a use that you say, okay, we have some of those uses and we're fine with them, and it would be better to create that listed as a conditional use and create the conditions, write the conditions as to why is that use okay in the location where it is.
Okay.
Sure.
Anyone else have any questions? I think we should probably meet again to discuss this. It would I know that after the first time I heard your presentation, I had questions. So it's really beneficial to hear it twice. So I think if we do another work session, and we can have Florence figure out a time and day that will work for everyone, I think it might make it easier, but please weigh in. If you think no, then go ahead, Ken.
I like that idea that we have another one. Could Mr. Patton maybe give us an idea, like Tom pointed out, and like with Liberty, if it's here and we have something there and it's not allowed, could you, give us a plan instead of, how we're gonna sit here and say, oh, yeah, that's right? Because I know what you were talking about, Swift Print and on the corner and whatever that is, Red Air, wouldn't fall into that. But it takes a little time when you're sitting here to figure out, oh, yeah, if you could, just like we said, where vehicle sales are, it says no in neighborhood mixed use. Well, we have one there now. So if you could, even if you just handwrite it or tell us what.
You want to know what's there?
That wouldn't conform with this.
So,
Not every one, if it's, let's use Liberty for an example. According to this new zoning, they can't be there. So that would be one of them, you'd say Liberty is in the neighborhood mixed use. Not every piece what's there.
Okay.
What we have now fits here.
and
If
actually,
it doesn't, just pinpoint that Swift Prints, Red Air couldn't be in this plan. That we, I think it would help all of us, because we'll go by landmarks, because we shop at all these places, so we know, oh yeah, I know where Red Air is, and this and that. And then we'd get a better idea.
and the analysis maps that you had gotten, all of those parcels
Right.
are highlighted, or they're in a spreadsheet. So we have owners and uses, so let me,
Like the case too with the beverage store.
As the drive-through.
yeah.
Not that we're wanting these businesses to leave, we want them to stay, and we like them here. It would just be as something.
Yeah.
There's grandfathered businesses, and there's, in the event that we have an opportunity to go in a different direction, we would like it to be ready.
Right. So we have in that packet of maps, there's a land use maps, which isn't as detailed as it needs to be for that sort of analysis, but each one of these parcels that's identified, so we do have them listed, easily identifiable, I guess you could say. So,
That's in our package, Chris?
it was the 11 by 17 maps?
Oh, this one here?
Yes, yes,
Page 3.
right. A more detailed list of uses or identification of uses, use categories is in the spreadsheets that I have. So it would be easy then to go through and you have that too, yeah. That's what I sent you last week.
You sent me last week.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, we like that the Liberty jingle said Parma paid season. So,
I want to keep that then for sure, it's iconic.
Absolutely.
Does anyone have anything further? Yes,
I just offer a comment. I
Yes.
simply want to say, Chris, that you really know your stuff, and we appreciate the thoroughness and your explanations, which are very, very important and clear.
I know I look really young, but I've been doing this for 30 years, so I'm glad it shows. I look young.
okay, so I'll have Florence get in touch with everyone so that we can schedule another work session, because we want to keep moving this process along. Hopefully catch up with planning so that we're kind of hitting the finish line at the same time.
What's the, before the end of the year, you want this passed?
That would be outstanding, yeah, preferably, you know.
Because the moratorium depends on us too, right? So, yeah.
When is, does anybody know when that's,
The moratorium?
yeah.
Well, you extended it for 6 months, and it expires February 15th or thereabouts. So we've said before that we would hope to not go that far.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you've had the benefit of Chris giving you the presentation she gave to planning last week. I think you can tell by what she's given you that there's been a lot of work done by her office, but we've worked on this on a pretty much a daily basis internally here. And I would encourage you to have as many meetings as you think you need to help refine this list, because we want all this input. It's teamwork. And we can, depending on how often you'd like to meet and we can move through this, we can get to the point where you might make some recommendations back to planning. We're not in that formal process yet, remember. It's planning. Council hasn't referred it to planning yet. We're still trying to do our due diligence, basically. So this hasn't been referred to planning yet, formally. But if we do this right, it might just take 1 or 2 planning meetings to send it back to council on the recommendation and start your process to go forward with the, the final approval of the ordinance that's going to be crafted as we go through this. So keep in mind, ask Florence for dates, and then we'll coordinate with Chris, because we need to make sure that she's going to be here.
Sure.
Yeah, I think this has been a very good meeting. Thank you.
There's nothing further. The work session is adjourned at 7:15.